The cafe smelled like burnt sugar and the faint tang of espresso. I sat in the corner by the window, one of those small tables that felt like it belonged to no one in particular. My laptop hummed quietly, though I wasn't typing. I was watching her, though she didn't know it yet. She came in like she had somewhere to be, but didn't want to hurry. The older woman, my girlfriend's sister, had a way of moving through the room that made people notice without her asking. She ordered a black coffee, exactly the way I remembered from the first time she visited this cafe. My memory of her was precise, down to the faint laugh that tugged at the corners of her mouth. I caught her glance once as she scanned the crowded tables. Noticing her felt strange. I looked away, pretending to adjust my notebook, but my eyes flicked back just in time to see her smirk softly, like she knew I was caught. She didn't say anything, just smiled faintly, and for some reason that made the empty hum of the cafe feel warmer. I had learned, the hard way, that noticing small things could be dangerous. Like the curl of her hair brushing her shoulder when she leaned over the counter, or the way she held her coffee cup with both hands. My text to my girlfriend had been unsent for days now, paused mid-thought, awkward, heavy with words I couldn't find. It wasn't dramatic. It was just quiet. Lonely in the way people forget to call someone back or linger a little too long at the edge of a conversation. "You always come here at this time?" she asked, sliding into the seat across from me before I could answer. Her voice was low, steady, like she had rehearsed it, but only enough to sound casual. Yeah. Afternoons usually quiet. Easier to think," I said, and for a second, I noticed how my hand fidgeted with the napkin under my coffee cup. I smoothed it out again, though it didn't change much. She nodded, not pressing further, just observing. There was a flicker in her eyes that didn't belong to anyone I knew. Something curious, maybe amused, maybe slightly concerned. "You like quiet, huh?" she said. "I guess. Helps me figure things out," I murmured, not looking at her directly. I watched her hands instead, folded neatly on the table. I wondered if she noticed the way my eyes lingered, as if memorizing something I couldn't name. The conversation meandered, slow, punctuated by pauses that weren't empty. She told me about a new book she'd picked up, and I made a comment I didn't even think about. She laughed softly, just enough to make the tiny hairs on my arm stand up. I realized halfway through that I hadn't noticed anyone else in the cafe for the past 10 minutes. Just her presence quietly moving into the space between the lines of my own thoughts. I sipped my coffee, bitter, and felt a twinge of guilt. Not guilt exactly, more like a small, quiet recognition that this was wrong in ways I didn't want to name. But still, I didn't stop noticing. Then she glanced at her watch, gathered her things slowly, and stood. She paused by the door, hand on the handle. I almost didn't dare to speak. "You know, if you want, I could check in on you while she's gone," she said. Just a suggestion, casual, but something in her tone made the air between us stick. I wanted to say yes. I didn't know why, and part of me felt like I shouldn't. My chest was tight, thoughts scattered. I nodded, swallowed. "Sure. I'd appreciate that." She smiled again, small, knowing. Then she left, and I stayed behind, staring at the door like it was a page I hadn't read yet. My coffee had gone cold. The chair opposite me seemed too empty, but not in the way I expected. Quiet, lingering, like a promise I wasn't sure I wanted to keep. And then, almost immediately after I picked up my notebook again, my phone buzzed. A message from her. Just 2 words. "See you." I didn't respond. Not yet. I just stared at the screen. The next afternoon, she showed up again, carrying a tote bag that looked too heavy for the slight curve of her shoulder. I wasn't sure why I had expected her. Maybe because the cafe had felt emptier without her, like a muted note I hadn't realized was missing. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, already sliding into the chair opposite me before I could answer. Her voice had that same casual tone, but it carried something else today. Tentative, maybe. "Of course," I said, and gestured to the chair across from my notebook. I felt the weight of it, as if my invitation was a fragile bridge we weren't ready to cross. We sat in the comfortable silence that had become familiar, punctuated by the low hum of espresso machines and the soft clatter of spoons against cups. She stirred her tea slowly, and I noticed her hands, again, long fingers tracing the rim of her cup, tapping once, twice, then still. Something deliberate in small gestures, a rhythm I didn't want to interrupt. "You ever miss something you can't even name?" she asked suddenly. Not looking at me directly, eyes on the swirling tea. I frowned, unsure how to answer. "I guess, yeah. Sometimes." I paused. "Little things mostly. Things people forget to say." She nodded slowly. "I miss having someone around who remembers. Details, even the dumb ones. Like how I take my tea, or the books I pick up when I can't sleep." She shrugged, as if letting out a secret she had been holding inside. I realized then how private this space felt. Dangerous, in a way that didn't scream danger but hummed quietly in the back of my chest. She was my girlfriend's sister, after all, and I had always been polite, careful. There were boundaries we weren't supposed to cross. But right now, boundaries felt like distant walls I could almost see through. "Do you think it's weird?" I asked, hesitant, like asking the question aloud might break something fragile between us. "What?" she said, looking up. Her gaze held mine longer than necessary, just long enough to make the quiet stretch taut. "Us. Talking like this. Me noticing, you noticing me." I rubbed the back of my neck, hoping I didn't look as awkward as I felt. She smiled faintly, almost rueful. "Maybe a little, but only if we call it wrong. Right now, it's just quiet. Nothing else." I laughed softly, the sound awkward, and she tilted her head like she had heard the note of nerves I tried to hide. We went back to stirring, sipping, letting silence fill the spaces words couldn't reach. Then, without warning, she reached over to help me pick up a fallen napkin. Our fingers brushed, light, brief, enough to make my chest tighten and my thoughts scatter. She pulled her hand back casually, as if nothing had happened, but the moment lingered between us like smoke in a sunbeam. I swallowed. "I don't know why that moment stayed with me," I said quietly, almost to myself. "Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me." She didn't answer, only smiled, eyes soft, acknowledging something that didn't need a name. And just like that, the cafe, normal, mundane, had transformed. The air between us was a thread stretched taut, and I wasn't sure if it would snap or hold us both. The next evening, the cafe was quieter than usual. The hum of the espresso machine seemed louder, the clink of cups sharper. She arrived just as I was closing my laptop, carrying that same tote bag, heavier than it needed to be. I smiled a little too quickly. She smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes the way it had the day before. She slid into the chair across from me, but there was a space between us now, a deliberate pause I couldn't ignore. "You've been quiet," she said, voice soft, casual. But I noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing at the door. Waiting for someone. Or maybe waiting for me to say something. I guess I've been thinking," I said, unsure how much to admit. My hands folded around the coffee cup, fingers tight. My thumb traced the rim. A nervous habit I couldn't hide. She looked at me, watching the motion, but didn't comment. Instead, she stirred her tea slowly, a small, precise circle. I realized how much I was watching her, and it made me flinch. Then the door opened, and someone I knew from the neighborhood waved at me. "A friend." I smiled, said a brief hello. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me. And in that moment, something shifted. The intimacy we'd been building felt exposed, fragile. "Did she tell you to check on me again?" I asked, too quietly. I hated the question the moment it left my mouth. Her lips pressed together. "Not really," she said, finally looking away. "I just thought it might be easier." "Easier? Not right. Not wrong. Just easier." I nodded, pretending to sip my coffee, but my thoughts raced. My chest tight. The rhythm of her spoon against the cup. The quiet hum of the machine. I imagined what it would be like to reach out, just once, brush my hand against hers. Stop before anything was said. Stopped before anything changed. She leaned over slightly, as if reading something on my screen, her shoulder brushing mine. I didn't move. Couldn't. My mouth opened, words ready, but they vanished. I imagined saying something, telling her I was drawn to her in ways I shouldn't. But then the door opened again, and someone walked in. A regular. Coffee order. Simple interruption. She straightened immediately, smoothing her sweater, a practiced shift back into normal. But my heart hadn't caught up. We sat in silence after that, the air heavy with almosts. Almost words. Almost touches. Almost confessions. And then, as she gathered her bag to leave, our eyes met. Too long. I felt the heat rise in my chest. She paused at the door, hand on the handle. See you tomorrow? I whispered, barely. Her eyes softened, just a fraction, and she smiled. Not fully, not as she did before, just enough to make the air between us tremble. Then, the almost, her hand lifted, hovering just above mine on the table. I froze, wanting to close the distance, wanting to, but she pulled back. A small, deliberate step back, her fingers brushing mine for less than a heartbeat. And she was gone. The cafe felt too big, too empty. My hand lingered where hers had been. I tasted coffee and regret at the same time, and for the first time, I realized how dangerous quiet could be. The park was almost empty. A late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the path, turning the benches gold and leaving the rest in half-light. I was walking beside her, careful to match her pace, careful not to let my eyes linger too long on the curve of her smile or the way her coat hung just right. You always walk this way? I asked, trying to sound casual, though my chest felt tight. She shrugged. Sometimes. It's quieter. Less people asking questions. We passed a bench, and I almost suggested sitting. Almost. My stomach nodded when I realized I wanted her to sit, even if only for a moment, so I could watch the light catch her face. She noticed, I think, because she slowed, letting me fall slightly behind, then fell back in a step beside me. Silence stretched. Not uncomfortable, exactly. Tense in a way that made every small sound feel sharp. A bird calling, the distant thump of a soccer ball. I wanted to say something. Anything. But all I could do was notice. The way her hands folded over her bag strap. The way her lips pressed together when she was thinking. Do you ever regret things? I asked, voice low, hesitant. She looked at me, surprised. Not the question, but the way I said it. The pause before it left my mouth. She didn't answer immediately, only glanced at the path ahead, then back at me, and I could see the flicker of something, guilt? Longing? Both. Sometimes, she said finally. But, it's complicated. Things you do, things you feel, can't always be explained. Her eyes softened, but there was a shadow there. Even if you want to. I swallowed. I think. I might be feeling that right now, I said, words halting, clumsy, like I was testing them out. Not exactly regret. Maybe. I don't know. Something like fear. Of losing control. Her gaze dropped, a micro flicker of unease. Of me. I wanted to nod. To reach for her hand. To say something I didn't have words for. But instead I stayed quiet, letting the space between us carry the weight. We walked a little further, the shadows lengthening. She shifted her bag, brushing against my arm. I didn't move. Couldn't. The quiet was enough. Too much. And still, it wasn't spoken aloud. The things I wanted to say, the things I wanted to feel. You make it complicated, she said finally, almost a whisper, more to herself than me. Being here, like this, with you. I laughed softly, bitterly. You think I don't know? She didn't answer, just kept walking, shoulders slightly hunched, like she was carrying a weight she didn't want me to see fully. We reached the bench we had almost sat on earlier. She paused, letting me walk slightly ahead to give her room, but not too much. The sun caught her hair, made the ends glow. She tilted her head, looking at me with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. And then she asked, in a voice barely above the wind, if we keep doing this, what happens next? I wanted to answer. Wanted to tell her exactly what I felt. But all I could do was glance down, fingers curling against the strap of my bag, and feel the tension in my chest tighten. The question hung between us, heavy, unanswered, and we both knew. Something had shifted. Something irreversible was just beyond the next step. The next week, she stopped showing up at the cafe. I waited at the corner table, sipping cold coffee, letting the minutes blur. Each time the door opened, hope flared briefly, then died when it wasn't her. I found myself imagining reasons, traffic, a sudden meeting, a late call, but none of them felt right. Then I noticed she had stopped answering my messages. Not a busy tone, not a delay, nothing. I stared at the last message I had sent, words carefully chosen, unsent in half my drafts. Do you want to meet? The phone felt heavier than it ever had. When we did meet, on a weekday evening, by chance, at the park, she seemed different, distant, polite, careful with every word. The subtle warmth, the soft smiles, the lingering looks, they were gone. I wanted to ask why, but even my own mouth felt foreign. You seem busy these days, I said finally, voice uncertain. I've been thinking, she replied, her eyes scanning the path ahead instead of mine. A lot of things. About everything. Her bag swung slightly on her shoulder, brushing mine for a fraction of a second. It should have felt familiar. It didn't. I realized she was holding herself differently, almost guarding something. I walked beside her, silent, stomach tight. I tried to imagine what it was. Maybe an ex she hadn't mentioned, someone who came back unexpectedly. Maybe a child, a responsibility I hadn't known. Maybe the walls she'd built around herself. Is something bothering you? I asked, too quietly. She glanced at me, lips pressing together, then quickly looked away. No, nothing you need to worry about. But I could see it. The hesitation, the pull, the subtle distance that hadn't been there before. I wanted to follow, to lean in, to bridge it. But she had already stepped ahead, leaving the shadow of space between us. That night, I wrote a message I didn't send. Typed, deleted, typed again. Words I couldn't commit to. I miss you. Are you okay? I didn't send it. The screen went dark, and I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The emptiness didn't hurt the way heartbreak might. It was quieter, more disorienting. Suspended. The cafe felt wrong without her. Every chair I passed on the way home seemed too small, too empty. The cup I hadn't finished sat on the counter, abandoned. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. And then the next morning, her chair was empty again. I didn't knock on her door. I didn't call. I just waited. She appeared at my doorstep that evening without a warning, just a shadow framed in the dim porch light. I was halfway through washing dishes, one hand still soapy, when I realized the knock wasn't the usual neighborhood interruption. It was her. I hope I'm not intruding, she said softly. Her coat smelled faintly of rain and coffee, familiar yet distant. I gestured for her to step in. The apartment felt smaller than usual, almost fragile in its quietness. The hum of the fridge, the clink of dishes, ordinary sounds. But tonight, they seemed loaded with expectation. I didn't know if I should, she began, voice trailing off. She paused, letting the silence speak. Me neither, I admitted, setting down the sponge. My hands lingered in the warm water, hesitant. I didn't know if I wanted to step closer or retreat. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me. I didn't mean to pull away. I just didn't know how to be here. With you. With myself. I nodded, words lodged somewhere between throat and tongue. I thought maybe you didn't want to. Or maybe you had to choose something else. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. She let a quiet laugh escape. Choosing something else, yeah? Life isn't simple, is it? I shrugged. No, not simple. But maybe we're allowed a little complicated, sometimes. Her gaze flicked to my hands, still damp from the dishes, and I realized she noticed my nervous energy. She took a small step closer, tentative. I wasn't sure if I could risk it. Risk this. I was scared too, I admitted finally. My words were low, stripped of any pretense, scared of losing it, of losing you. She paused. We stayed like that, the space between us vibrating with what hadn't been said for weeks. I wanted to reach for her hand, to close that distance, but I waited. Let her decide the pace. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she extended her hand, brushing the back of mine. It wasn't dramatic, not a declaration, just a small, careful touch that carried more weight than any words could. I exhaled, not relief, not triumph, just recognition that we had arrived somewhere we hadn't known we were going, together. Okay, she said softly. A single word, but it held everything. The acknowledgement, the permission, the trust. I nodded. Okay. And for a moment, that was enough. A quiet understanding, a human connection, small and precise, like folding a napkin just so, or watching the sun catch the rim of a coffee cup. It didn't erase the weeks of tension, the missed messages, the boundaries we'd crossed in thought, but it made the present tangible, safe, and real. We stayed like that for a while. No need for more words. Just the small rhythm of existence, shared, without spectacle. Weeks passed. The cafe corner we used to occupy felt familiar again, though now it carried a softer weight. She arrived at 8:47 a.m., like clockwork, carrying a tote that had lost its heaviness. I watched her smile, small and precise, as she ordered her black coffee, and for a moment, the world narrowed to that ordinary ritual. We walked to the park afterward, taking the same quiet path we had once wandered hesitantly. The bench was waiting, not as a symbol of tension, but as a punctuation to the life we were slowly folding together. I noticed how she tucked her hair behind her ear, how the sunlight hit the ends just so. Tiny details I had memorized without trying. You remembered, she said, noticing my glance. Not teasing, not dramatic, just noting a fact. I always do, I murmured. And I did, because remembering was part of caring, part of staying. Our conversations had changed, too. Less testing, less pause-filled uncertainty, more quiet understanding. She told me about work, I told her about my mornings. We shared tea sometimes, black coffee other times, and sometimes just silence that felt alive rather than empty. One evening, we found ourselves back at the kitchen, folding napkins together. I didn't think about what it meant. I just watched her hands, noticed the faint tremor when she laughed softly at something I had said. She glanced up, caught my look, and smiled. Nothing more than that, but it felt enough. Life was still ordinary. Bills had to be paid, errands ran, deadlines met. But in the spaces between, the half hour of shared coffee, the slow walk, the bench in the park, there was a rhythm now, subtle but sustaining. Something earned, not dramatic, not declared. We weren't perfect. We didn't need to be. There was warmth in the imperfection, comfort in knowing that even when one of us was quiet or distracted, the other would notice without question. The cafe corner, the bench, the black coffee at 8:47 a.m. They became small markers of a life moving forward together. I realized, slowly, that love didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it lingered quietly, in shared routines, in remembered details, in small touches that mattered more than words. I glanced at her as she stirred her tea, watching the tiny swirl. She caught my eye, and we both smiled softly, just a little, enough to acknowledge everything we had traversed to get here. And in that glance, I understood, the story wasn't in grand gestures. It was in the pauses, the silences, the simple things that had quietly stitched us together. The world could go on. Chaos could happen. But here, in these ordinary moments, we had found a kind of permanence that felt almost miraculous because it was ordinary, because it was real. I took a sip of my coffee and let the warmth settle. She did the same. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of unsent words, unspoken fears, or pauses that stretched too long. I just felt the present. Only we would know its quiet magic. Did this story stay with you? What kind of quiet, real love stories do you want to hear next?